Hello everybody and welcome to my second video ever. For those of you who haven't watched my video on how to write a DBQ, we went over the rubric as well as some exemplars that were put out by College Board. I will leave a link to that video in the description. For this video, I want to go over the just a quick summary of the periods 3 to 7, which may appear on the exam tomorrow, and hopefully give you guys some info, and that way you guys will have it all in your head tomorrow when you go and do the your exam. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start with period 3, and as you can see there is some just a summary. So they could call it the Age of Washington. It's like I believe it's from 1754 to 1800. Let me actually get my prep book open for this one. Okay. So, sorry about that. 1754 to 1800. So some of the big things here is at the beginning of this period, America was still a part of Britain. And obviously we know the French and Indian War. If we get an essay tomorrow regarding why the revolution happened and why we left the Union, here is the answer. So the French and Indian War expenses led to increasing conflicts between the mother country and the colonies. So before the French and Indian War even began, there was a period known as solitary neglect, which was effectively ended by the French and Indian War. Solitary neglect was because Britain was having their own problems at home with the Civil War. They were having problems at home. So the colonies were basically left to rule themselves for a little while. This is where we got our first taste of self-government. And then, of course, the French and Indian War happened. And following that, solitary neglect was ended, and there was increased taxation to pay for the war in our country. So if you want to know what those that includes the Sugar Act, which placed a tax on foreign sugar and certain luxuries. Stamp Act placed a tax on pretty much all goods like that were paper, so newspapers, etc. Then you had several other acts like the Townsend Act, which placed duties on colonial imports of tea, glass, and paper. So this obvious, and then at the same time, there were some acts that were passed that breached on some civil liberties, like the Quartering Act, which required the colonists to provide food and living quarters for British soldiers stationed in the colonies. And so this was so they went from being able to govern themselves to virtually having their freedoms stripped and having to pay these taxes to a foreign nation. This led to some unhappiness, as you could suspect. And as you know, there was the Boston Tea Party where they threw all the tea off the harbor. And then that led us to the Coercive Acts, the Intolerable Acts, and the biggest part of that, the Coercive Acts, which was to basically punish the state of Massachusetts and Boston. The first thing was the port of Boston was closed, so there was no trade in or out of the harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act reduced the power of the Massachusetts legislature while increasing the power of the royal governor. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Great Britain instead of in the colonies, and that applied to everybody. And a fourth law expanded the Quartering Act to enable British troops to be quartered in private homes, and this applied to all of the colonies. So, as you can see, the British are really stepping in and infringing on the liberties of the Americans. People aren't happy. On top of this, there were the Enlightenment ideals, which came from John Locke and the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Enlightenment ideas had came over from Europe, and they had a lot of influence on the educated Americans in the 1860s and 1870s, and on the top founding fathers, and a lot of it ended up in our Constitution. So essentially, the revolution, when it began, there was the First Continental Congress, which did not want war. It was more just to resist the acts that were put ahead by Britain. Then fighting began at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world. I'm sure you've heard that. And then that led the Battle of Bunker Hill, where basically a colonial militia from Massachusetts fortified Breed's Hill next to Bunker Hill, for which the ensuing battle was wrongly named. A British force attacked the colonists' position and managed to take the hill, suffering over 1,000 casualties. Americans claimed a victory of sorts, having succeeded in inflicting heavy losses on the attacking army. And this is because they basically used tactics of sneak up. It wasn't the big shooting in the field for this one. For the first time, and that's modern fighting kind of began. The Second Continental Congress was created after the fighting broke out, still not looking for war, which is why they offered the olive branch petition to King George III, but it was rejected, and all chances at peace failed. And more calls for independence were coming, and eventually on a resolution calling for independence was brought to the floor on July 2nd, and it was adopted on July 4th, 1776. This led to the Revolutionary War. It's said that about 1/3 joined the Patriots, 1/3 stick with the Loyalists, which was wealthier, but more of the wealthier classes, but still people from all classes. And then there was 1/3 that stayed neutral. At first, the Americans suffered heavy losses, and they had to spend a very severe winter at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. But then we had the alliance with France, and after the Battle of Saratoga, they openly sided with us and joined us in the war. They came back. We had victory at Yorktown, where they formed a naval blockade while Washington defeat General Charles Cornwallis. And that was it. That was the end of the war. So virtually that led to the government being formed. Originally, we had the Articles of Confederation, which was a weak government. They did not have a lot of power, mainly because they could not levy taxes on the people. They could not levy taxes. And they were at Shays' Rebellion, they were unable to really enforce that, so they appeared weak. And therefore, we went instead for the Constitution. So there were a lot of problems under the Articles. So we had the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And here are some of the key issues that were there. So representation was a big issue. Bigger states like Virginia had a plan. It was called the Virginia Plan. For the bigger states, wanted this. They wanted to have a system like our House of Representatives, where every state is represented by like the congressional districts. You have a certain number of representatives. It depends on how large your state is. While the New Jersey plan wanted us to have 2 people representing each state, and that's where you get your Senate. So that's where you see you got the Congress and the Senate there, but there was 2 separate plans. The Connecticut Compromise allowed for a 2-house legislature with those 2, and we still have that system today. Slavery was one of the more contentious issues as well, and the delegates agreed to the 3/5 compromise, which is actually pretty awful, where they basically counted the slaves as 3/5 of a person. And basically, that was how they determined how they counted population for slaves and stuff. And yeah, not good. So there was also two sort of factions that broke out there, where you get your two-party system, where you got the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted to give power to the federal government, and the Anti-Federalists wanted states' power, as you probably know already. And then the Bill of Rights was the first 10 amendments. I'm not going to go through all of them. Obviously, you know the First Amendment. If you want to look them up on your own, please do so. It could be important. The First Amendment is a very big one. That is freedom of speech and religion. And the second one is the right to bear arms. Those are probably the two that we hear the most about today. A lot of them were based on the courts. They were very court heavy, that's for sure. And then you had the first president, President George Washington, became the first president of the United States. He was picked unanimously. He was America's hero, and he became our president. And then foreign affairs during the early days, we declared neutrality in the French Revolution. There was some at first, Americans had some sympathy for the French Revolution, but obviously that changed as we saw what was going on there, and that we did move into the Midwest, and we defeated the Native Americans there and moved into the Midwest. The United States did, and there was also the Jay's Treaty was probably the biggest one, and it was to work out trade agreements with England and stop seizures and impressments. So then we had and they had several points there. The British promised to evacuate the northern ports. U.S. maintains right to trade with British West Indies. British would stop seizing ships not bound for France or French possessions. U.S. allowed British privateers in U.S. ports, but not French. Nothing was said about impressment, though. So essentially, that's where we came from. That's what we're talking about. We did have another president during this period. Actually, I'm going to start doing this. We did have another president. We had President John Adams, who obviously we had some troubles with France, and France basically didn't like our neutrality. They sent 3 men here to negotiate some sort of an alliance, but then we were outraged. That led to the Quasi-War, almost completely fought over sea. And then some of the more controversial acts of the Adams administration, alien and sedition. It lengthened the period for gaining citizenship to 14 years, and it basically the government could punish people for criticizing them. And then the Kentucky and Virginia were like, no, we're not going to do that. So they brought up resolutions nullifying that, which this was the first time nullification could ever really happen. That was a new standard. And then obviously America began to grow and a national identity began to form. And then the next thing that's going to happen is we're going to start moving westward. So that is period 3 in a nutshell. So period 4 was the peaceful transfer of power election of 1800. Period 4 was from 1800 to 1848. So the first president we see here is Jefferson. Jefferson and Burr tied the election, but it was resolved by the House of Representatives. And then we had the Louisiana Purchase, which was huge. 1803, Napoleon was fighting wars in Europe. He couldn't take care of Louisiana, so he offered to sell it to us, and we bought it and basically America doubled in size and gained control of the Mississippi River. And then this led to the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was sent by Jefferson to explore possible water routes to the west, scientific studies of plants, animals, and Native Americans. And as you know, on their way out there, they ran into Sacagawea, and you know that whole story, and they made it out to Oregon. They reached the West Coast, and they basically explored all this new uncharted territory. And Sacagawea, as you know, was the communicator. She communicated to the people as they headed out to like native peoples to keep the peace, because she knew how to talk to them and stuff. And they were able to get better, because of that, they were able to get better relations with Native Americans. They were able to really work out some trades on their way out there, and they discovered a whole heck of a lot of our country. But moving on, other foreign affairs, obviously Jefferson had to deal with Barbary pirates, successionist schemes in the West, attempts to purchase such obtain Florida. There was the Chesapeake Affair in 1807. An American ship was boarded and sailors impressed off the coast of Virginia. Jefferson imposed a drastic embargo in 1807 to keep America neutral. It failed and was a disaster politically and economically. Causes of the War of 1812. So if you want to know how the War of 1812 was started, this was under the James Madison presidency, kind of, by the way. I kind of skipped over this in the notes that I'm reading, but this is during Madison's presidency. Seizures of American ships on the seas. That's why it started. After wars in the French Revolution, it was from the wars in the French Revolution, and it violated our neutrality, and which is a theme you're going to hear a lot throughout this talk. So basically, resentment was still left over the revolution. Americans believed that the British were arming and inciting Native Americans in the West. War hawks were elected to Congress. The most notable of these people was Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who argued for war. And virtually they voted in favor of it. And we had this was also a run for territory in Florida and Canada. And the Federalist Party was dead. So Federalist New Englanders were opposed to the war. Yet again, we still had the war, and their proposals seemed traitorous once the news of New Orleans arrived in Washington when we won, and the Federalist Party was done. That was the last time you're going to hear about them. So then you had the Treaty of Ghent, which was signed, and we had peace finally. This person does not like to talk about wars. Okay, so they completely skipped the 1812 war, but as you know, we ended up winning the war. Let's see, where are we at? And we moved on. That moved us on with the Treaty of Ghent, which was signed 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans, which they fought that battle. As you can see, Andrew Jackson was considered a war hero. You're going to hear a lot more about him. There were naval victories in Erie and Champlain. And this is where the national banner was written. A lot of people think it was written in the Revolutionary War. I thought that at one point, but no, apparently it was the War of 1812. So then nationalism in the West, and there was increased white settlement set as land was cleared of the Indians. Obviously not good that we did that. We did some pretty awful things when it comes to that, but we continue to move further and further west and settle there on other people's lands. Pretty terrible. Economic nationalism encouraged American industry to avoid foreign entanglements. Congress chartered the Second National Bank was created and passed a protective tariff to protect American industries from European competition. Congress voted funds for the road construction at federal expense. Madison vetoed this. Panic of 1819 caused more Americans to be involved in politics. There was the Henry Clay's American System, which is a plan for economic self-sufficiency, a protective tariff, a second national bank, federally funded internal improvements. West and South would exchange agricultural goods for manufactured goods from the North. Eventually, North and West would have stronger ties than the South and West. So in short, Henry Clay had this whole system, and he never became president. And then there was the era of good feelings, this was James Monroe's presidencies. That's what they called it. And the reason it was, he got 2 terms with support from all sections. There was no opposition party. The Democratic Republicans had full control virtually. And John Marshall continued to assert federal authority through Supreme Court decisions, Marbury v. Madison, which was judicial review, McCulloch versus Maryland, which is the Bank IS constitutional, and Gibbons v. Ogden, the interstate commerce. And the Missouri Compromise was an example of regionalism or sectionalism. And this was where Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. But the North was like, wait a second, that's not fair. Now the South has an extra state. So they created Maine as a free state in order to keep the balance. And they used the 36-30 line for the remainder of states that was supposed to be the thing that was going to determine whether a new state coming in was a slave state or a free state. As you will see, that will not hold up. But for now, that's what we were thinking. Another big Monroe accomplishment was the Monroe Doctrine, which is where we said to Europeans, you can't go into the Western Hemisphere. You can't intervene in these Latin American countries. We wouldn't allow it. And basically what happened was we had a market revolution and a shift away from moral economy. People began to grow crops and produce goods for the market. Money received went to purchase goods produced by others from the market, and system encouraged specialization. And this is where we started to have the factory revolution, and especially in the North. Industrialization began. You've probably heard of the Lowell system, which is where they basically began making cloth, and basically women began to buy rather than produce cloth. This was the beginning of consumerism. And for the first time ever, women were starting to go to work. There was the factory girls. They were not paid much, and early factory conditions were not good, and we'll get more into that when we get into the progressive era and the Gilded Age. But virtually, that was a big thing. There was the Eli Whitney created the cotton gin, the interchangeable parts. Steam power was becoming a huge thing. There were inventions like John Deere's steel plow, Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper. And then there was also an increase in transportation. Railroads were going up. This was a huge thing, especially in the North. Canals, roads, steamboats. The population was going up. There was more immigration from the Irish and Germans. And really, the country is changing. We're shifting towards an industrial era. Then obviously there was the Jackson era, which was the politics of the common man. So this brought about universal male suffrage, improved education system, state suffrage laws, party nominating conventions, popular elections of electoral college, two-party system, which is where we got the Democrats now. This is going to be coming. And then the spoils system, which was the giving of government jobs to political supporters, and Jackson was a strong supporter of the system. Obviously a very corrupt system that will eventually be repealed. But the election of 1824 was pretty controversial. Jackson, Adams, and Clay all split the electoral votes, and what happened was the election went to the House of Representatives, and Clay used his influence to swing votes to Adams in return for a cabinet position, which was the Secretary of State. So that made Adams president, and the Jackson supporters were not happy. They called it the corrupt bargain. And basically, Jackson came back in 1828, and he ended up beating John Adams this time with a much bigger support, and that basically Jackson became president. The nullification crisis came up during Jackson's presidency, and even though Jackson was a states' rights supporter, he was also a unionist. There was a big debate. South Carolina held a secession convention and passed a resolution not to collect the tariff. This is over the tariff of 1828. This was the first time a state succeeded, and you will see that South Carolina will be the first state to succeed later. This is where the idea of succession came from. And then you had Jacksonian democracy in perspective, where we had the two-party system was developing. His campaign really appealed to the common man, and we know how that went, even though he really wasn't common man. And 78% of eligible voters turned out for his election, so people were excited. People were turning out. However, his record, like I said, is less democratic. The Indian Removal Act, defying the Supreme Court, and the threat of military action against South Carolina were not very democratic moves. And then during this time, there was also several reform movements: the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, with Christian revivalism across the nation. The temperance movement wanted to eliminate alcohol. The abolitionists wanted to get rid of slavery, and we will talk more about this to come. Women's rights, the Seneca Falls Convention was a meeting for women's rights activists, and they finally came up with an agenda. And then, obviously, this is the first time we're going to start to talk about African Americans in our country. And the majority of African Americans living in the U.S. during the first half of the 19th century were enslaved, which is not good. That's terrible. Working as forced laborers on farms in the South and West. Although enslaved owners denied them their basic rights and liberties, enslaved people resisted slavery through small acts of defiance, as well as large-scale uprisings. So basically, when our country was founded, even though we said we're going to give rights to all men, we continued the practice of slavery in our country. And so at this point, we were really just kind of defying our own message by doing this, and it was terrible the way we did this. And slave owners gave their slaves little rights, and practically they were just selling them off. Like, it was awful. Selling people is terrible. And then there was King Cotton. A lot of the reason the South was so attached to slavery was because they wanted to have slaves to work in the cotton farms. Meanwhile, plantations. Meanwhile, up in the North, we're industrializing, so slave labor is no longer needed. And I mean, really, it's never a good way to go about labor. But I mean, the South thought they needed to use that system to run their fields, and the North was starting to realize at this point that slavery was not a good was a horrible practice, and that slavery was disgusting. And we're going to start talking about that in time period 5 in my next and final video to prepare you guys for the APUSH exam. So the part 2 to this, I'm going to post another video soon with time period 5, 6, and 7, where we're going to start talking about manifest destiny. We're going to talk about the debate over slavery leading up to the Civil War. We're going to talk about the Gilded Age that followed the Civil War, the Progressive Era, and then the World Wars. So, look forward to seeing you guys then. Thank you everybody for watching. Stay tuned for my next video, which will be posted at the same time as this one. Okay.